I don't know if I should even be writing this. It's not a matter of me being too scared or too emotional, I'm afraid I'm already too far gone. But maybe, just maybe, if someone reads this, they'll finally understand why I don't leave the house anymore. Why I haven't spoken to anyone for days. Why I'm sitting here with nothing but a pad of paper and a broken pen, trying to piece together something that barely feels real anymore. Something that started on a day like any other. It all began on an ordinary Monday morning. February 3, 2025. The air was frigid, and the grayness of the sky seemed to press in on everything. I was in the middle of my shift at the city police department when the first call came in, a body found at Maple and 4th, near the old diner. Looks like a woman. No signs of struggle. Just, gone. I'd heard that kind of thing before, so I didn't think much of it at first. Bodies turned up all over the city, especially in neighborhoods like ours. The people who lived here knew better than to trust anyone too far outside their social circles. But then the second call came in, just an hour later, same area. A different woman. Same situation. Just gone. No sign of a fight. I paused. Something about the timing felt off. I wasn't about to say it out loud, but I started to get this feeling, this prickling at the back of my neck. I'd seen enough death to know when something was amiss. By the time I arrived on the scene, a crowd had gathered. The flashing red and blue lights of the squad cars bathed the street in a grotesque glow, and there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Officers were talking in hushed tones, scanning the area, their gazes darting like they expected something more to happen. I pushed through the crowd and made my way to the body. What I saw made me feel sick, and not just because of the blood. No, it wasn't that. It was the expression on her face. Her eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, but not in the way I expected. They were wide, yes, but also somehow empty, hollow, like she was already gone the moment she'd been found. I bent over, trying to stay calm. This was a routine case, after all. Yet, as I looked at the marks on her wrists, the strange positioning of her limbs, I felt something gnaw at me from the inside. It wasn't until I heard Detective Madison Hayes speak from behind me that I realized I wasn't alone. Thought would get here sooner than this. I turned to see Madison standing there, her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. She was one of the best detectives we had on the force, no nonsense, sharp as a knife. But even she looked unnerved by the sight before us. What do you make of it? I asked, trying to steady my voice. She stepped forward, crouching beside the body. Her hands were gloved, but she still seemed hesitant as she inspected the corpse. I don't know, she muttered. It doesn't add up. No struggle. No visible wounds, not even a scratch. But the way she's positioned, it's deliberate. I've seen a case like this before. Same, absence. Like she was drained before she died. Maybe we're dealing with something new. My stomach dropped at her words. Something new. That phrase echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the thought. For a second, I felt like we were being watched. Like the entire street was holding its breath. I didn't have time to dwell on it, though. There were still too many questions left unanswered, and Detective Hayes seemed more focused on her gut feeling than any rational explanation. But she was right about one thing, this wasn't just another murder. Something else was going on here. As I looked around at the others on the scene, uniformed officers and medical personnel, all scrambling to process the situation, something occurred to me. The atmosphere was too quiet. Too tense. It wasn't just the murder itself that was off. It was the silence that followed. The world felt like it was holding its breath. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. By the time I got home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. There was something in the air, something thick and suffocating, as if the very city itself was holding its breath. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the world was changing, and not in a good way. I walked through the front door, dropped my jacket onto the couch, and headed straight to the kitchen for a glass of water. The lights flickered once, twice, before they settled into their usual dimness. It was when I reached for the faucet that I heard it. A scratching sound, faint at first, but growing louder. At first, I thought it was a stray animal. Maybe a raccoon or a cat, scratching at the window. But then it grew louder, almost rhythmic. It was coming from the back of the house, from the yard. I froze, the glass of water in my hand shaking. I didn't want to check. Not really. But some part of me knew I had to. I moved quietly through the dark hallway toward the back door, the noise growing louder as I approached. It wasn't a scratching anymore. It was knocking. Soft, but deliberate. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers cold. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. I cracked the door open, just a fraction, and peeked out. The yard was empty. No raccoon, no cat, no sign of life at all. But then, I saw it. A shape in the distance. Standing by the fence, where the light from the street lamp barely reached. It was a person, and they were watching me. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the silhouette in the yard. My breath caught in my throat, and for a split second, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, maybe I was just tired from the day. But no. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It was too deliberate, too still. It was like I was frozen in place. My fingers were still on the door, and the cold metal was pressing into my palm, but I couldn't make myself open it further, couldn't bring myself to step outside and confront whatever was standing there. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, perfectly still, in the same spot. I told myself I was being paranoid. That this was nothing, just another person out for a late walk. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Not with the way they stood, as if waiting for something. I couldn't see their face. The streetlight was dim, and it cast long shadows across their body, making their features impossible to read. But there was something about them, something off about the way they were positioned, the way they stared into the darkness like they were expecting something to emerge from it. I backed away from the door slowly, still watching. My heart thudded in my chest. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. I wanted to turn the lights on, but I was too afraid to make a noise. I didn't want to attract their attention, if that's what they were after. But then, it moved. A shift, almost imperceptible at first. Then, another. The figure began to turn, its head jerking toward the window, the one just inches away from where I stood, watching through the cracked door. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. I held my breath, praying that somehow, it hadn't seen me. But there was no way it didn't. The way its head snapped to the window, its body slightly hunched, I could feel it. The unnatural awareness. It knew I was there. I slammed the door shut, the sound of it echoing in the silent house. My pulse was racing, my hands trembling so violently that the glass of water I'd left on the counter tipped over, spilling across the floor. I couldn't hear anything except the pounding of my heart in my ears. My mind was a chaotic blur. What the hell was happening? Who was that? What did they want? I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, that this person, this thing, was watching me. Waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the knocking stopped. The sounds from outside ceased. The air around me felt thick, like it had absorbed the tension of what had just occurred. I tried to calm myself. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was some drunk, some random person who had gotten lost. But every instinct in me screamed that it wasn't. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. I grabbed my phone from the counter, hands still shaking, and dialed the only person I trusted. Madison Hayes. The phone rang 3 times before she picked up, her voice hoarse, like she had been asleep. "Elliot," she asked, groggy. "What's going on?" I need help," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. "There's someone outside. I think they're watching me." "I'm not sure, but, hold on," she interrupted, and I heard a shift on the other end of the line. She wasn't just groggy anymore. Her tone was sharper. "Where are you?" "I'm at home, in my place. Just outside the city." "I'm coming over," she said without hesitation. "Stay inside, lock the doors. Don't open up for anyone. Do you hear me?" I didn't argue. I didn't care that she sounded distant or a little annoyed. I could tell she wasn't taking this lightly. I hung up, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to breathe. She would be here soon, and whatever this was, whatever had just happened, maybe it would make sense then. Maybe this was just some strange coincidence, a late-night prank, but when I turned toward the living room window, I froze. There, just on the edge of the shadows, was the figure. I could barely make out the shape, but the way it was positioned, its head tilted slightly as if studying the house, it was the same person. Or, was it? I had to force myself to blink, to pull away from the window. My mind was swimming with 1,000 questions, but they all boiled down to the same, terrifying idea. This wasn't a coincidence, this wasn't just some random person outside my house. It was something much worse. I moved quickly, locking the doors and closing the blinds, even though it felt futile. How could I keep something like that out? If it had been standing out there, watching for this long, what would stop it from getting inside? I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, its cold steel feeling heavy in my grip. It didn't make me feel safe, but it was the only thing I had. I waited, minutes passed, Madison hadn't arrived yet. I checked the time. 5 minutes. 10. 15. The silence was deafening. It was so quiet now that I could hear the faintest sound from outside, the soft scrape of shoes across the concrete. The unmistakable sound of someone moving closer. I darted to the window once more, my heart racing as I tried to see anything that would explain what was happening, and then I saw it, the figure, standing in the exact same spot, but now there was something different about it. There was movement in its hand, something shiny reflecting the dim light. I couldn't make out the details at first, but then it became clear. A knife, the person was holding a blade, its edge glinting under the street lamp, and that's when I realized, this wasn't a person. This wasn't some drunk, or a random passerby. It was a predator, and I was the prey. I couldn't breathe. The knife glinted in the pale light, its edge sharp and clean, reflecting the glow of the street lamp like it was waiting to be used. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its presence so oppressive, so wrong, that I almost felt like I was suffocating under the weight of it. I backed away from the window slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to run, to grab the nearest exit and escape. But where would I go? How could I escape something like that? The streets were cordoned off. The entire city had been shut down. No one was coming. No one but me and, whatever that was. I couldn't help but think of the 2 bodies found earlier that day. The women with no struggle, no signs of fight. The bodies drained, hollowed out. Was this the same thing? Was this thing going after me, too? The scraping sound from outside was getting closer now. It was unmistakable, the soft, deliberate shuffle of someone walking slowly, as though savoring every step. Every moment, and then, a knock. It wasn't just at the door this time. No, this time, it was at the window. I jerked away from the wall, feeling the blood drain from my face. The window, my living room window, was wide open. How could I have forgotten? I hadn't closed it earlier, in my panic. It was an open invitation for whatever was out there. I couldn't get to it in time. A shadow moved past the window, blocking out the dim streetlight for a second. I heard a low, guttural sound from outside. Not a voice, but something closer to an animal's growl, though it wasn't quite like anything I had ever heard before. My body was frozen. I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't obey me, my thoughts were scattered, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, so loud it felt like it was echoing in the room. The knock on the window came again. I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure was close now. Too close. I should have run. I should have screamed, I should have done something, anything. But all I could do was stand there, paralyzed with fear, as the seconds stretched on like an eternity. Suddenly, the lights flickered, once, twice, and then, the power went out. The darkness that followed was suffocating. The only light came from the faint glow of the street lamp outside, but it wasn't enough to show me anything clearly. My eyes strained, trying to make sense of the shadows that moved around me. But everything was a blur, just shapes, indistinct, like smoke coiling in the air. I heard it then. The footsteps. The heavy, deliberate sound of boots hitting the pavement, approaching. The scrape of something metallic being dragged behind. A door slamming. A whisper too low to make out. The room was completely silent now, save for my own ragged breathing. I tried to reach for my phone again, but my fingers were trembling so badly I couldn't grip it. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to hide, to run, but I knew it was pointless. There was no place to go. No place to hide. I couldn't escape this thing. It was here for me. And there was nowhere to hide. The doorbell rang. I don't know why it took me so long to realize what was happening. But then it hit me like a freight train. I wasn't alone in the house. The figure wasn't just outside. It was inside. Before I could even move, the door was pushed open, just a crack at first, the light from the street lamp casting a pale outline of a figure standing just beyond the threshold. It was him, the same figure from before, the person who had been watching me. His face was still shadowed, but I could see the faint outline of something beneath his hood. His eyes glinted in the dark, empty and hollow, like two black holes that sucked in all the light around them. He was smiling, no, grinning. I could see his teeth now, sharp and uneven, stained with something dark. "Let me in," his voice rasped. It wasn't human, it was hoarse and ragged, like he'd been choking on something for hours. "Get away from me," I finally managed to say, my voice weak. I backed away, shaking my head, but it was no use. He stepped forward, one slow, deliberate step after another, like a predator toying with its prey. And when he spoke again, it wasn't to me, it was to the darkness, as if he was speaking to someone else. "You think they can save you?" he whispered. "You think this is just a game? You're already mine." I tried to move, to scream, to do anything, but it was too late. The shadows around him seemed to shift and breathe. The very air felt thick, pressing against me, and I stumbled back, my legs giving way beneath me. I hit the floor hard, my back slamming against the cold wooden boards. The figure was standing over me now. His grin widened. It was the kind of smile that twisted something deep inside of me, a sickening, primal fear that came from knowing the monster before me wasn't just a killer, it was something ancient. Something that had been waiting for years, maybe even centuries, to finally walk again. And then I saw it, there, in the dim light. I saw the flash of his blade, the same one he'd been holding outside, now raised above me. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He didn't need to. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact, but it never came. Instead, I heard a crash from the hallway, the sound of something heavy being thrown against the wall. Freeze. I opened my eyes to see Madison standing in the doorway, her gun drawn, her eyes wild. Behind her, several officers had arrived, finally, it seemed, but none of them seemed to notice what was happening. They couldn't see what I saw. They were all looking at the figure in the doorway. But none of them knew what he was. I heard Madison shout again, but her words were lost in the blur. The figure in front of me raised his hand, the blade gleaming under the dim light. A sickening silence followed, broken only by the sharp crack of a gunshot, then, darkness. I don't remember much after that. I woke up in a hospital bed hours later, surrounded by police officers and paramedics. Madison was there, her face pale and exhausted, her eyes wide with worry. "Elliot, you're safe now," she whispered, but I couldn't shake the image of the figure in my mind. They told me the case was closed. That the killer had been caught. That the streets were safe again, but I know better. I know what I saw. And I know that nothing, can ever erase the shadow that lingers in the corners of my mind. The figure, it's still out there. Watching, waiting, and I'm not sure I'll ever be truly safe.